ladies and gentlemen, once again. We are now moving on to the panel discussion. We are going to have 4 presentations, and after that, we'll proceed into an open mic session where you can have the opportunity to make contributions and ask questions. At the podium, at the table, we have with us, from my far right, Dr. Rodney Worrell, who is a lecturer in history in the Department of History and Philosophy here at the UWI-Kayville. Dr. Worrell is a specialist in black radicalism. He has written extensively on the UNIA in Barbados, and he has at press contributions on the Black Power movement in Barbados. Give Dr. Worrell a warm welcome.
Thank you.
Next to Dr. Worrell is Professor Alan Cobley, who is a professor of Southern African history. He has taught courses on apartheid in South Africa, imperialism, and he has written extensively on Caribbean migration to Africa, in particular seafarers, sailors, and also on the education system in the Caribbean. Please give Professor Cobley a warm welcome. We have also with us distinguished professor of political science, Dr. Elwood Dunn, who is Liberian, or Barbadian Liberian, what should I say? Liberian. Liberian. All the way Liberian. He said all the way Liberian. But with his presence here, we will give him honorary Barbadian citizenship. Dr. Dunn has researched and written extensively on Liberia-Barbados relations. We would hear from him first, but before we do so, we have again with us Dr. Carrie Banton, who you heard earlier. And after the presentations by the 3 other experts, Dr. Banton will respond. We will begin by having Dr. Elwood Dunn making his presentation. Dr. Dunn.
Thank you very much. Good morning still, I guess. Yeah.
Bring it a bit nearer, maybe.
Okay, can you hear me better now? Okay, very good. No. Okay, what can you do?
Bring it as near as you can.
No, just keep talking. He'll get it.
Okay.
Yeah, just keep talking.
Okay. It's coming now. Okay, well, thanks very much for this opportunity to say a few words on this special occasion of Liberia and Barbados coming together. Before I say the few random thoughts that I have jotted down, I'd like to just make a general comment that I hope fits into the grand theme of our gathering here on this occasion. And that has to do with what I sense as a Liberian search for identity that begins to happen in the aftermath of 2 crises in the history of the country. The first one was the military coup d'etat that brought down the First Republic in 1980. And the second one is the civil war that ensued, starting in 1989 and really not ending until 2003. I see what is going on here as a small piece of this search for identity. You know, Liberia is a mosaic of a lot of people. I heard reference to 16 ethnic groups. Actually, there are more than 16 ethnic groups in Liberia. And then you have Liberians coming from many other African countries. And so we are in the aftermath of these two crises, I think, charged with the responsibility of redefining ourselves. We have not done so yet. And what is going on here is just a part of it. You will see a little bit more of what I'm saying when the group leaves from here next year and go to Liberia, in terms of the reaction of Liberians to this quest for identity that I'm talking about. I'd just like to make that point before I get into my statement. So permit me to register my thanks and appreciation to Ambassador Witherspoon and his team for inviting me to share with you this historic occasion. I feel flattered to be counted among the witnesses to this moment in history, this moment that celebrates a movement. And it was indeed a movement in history when circumstances on Africa's west coast and here in the Caribbean converged to produce the emigration of scores of residents of this land to the then fledgling Republic of Liberia. What a history to recall those hardy souls who ventured to leave the land of their nativity and join their brothers and sisters struggling to forge a new nation, a decidedly black nation. Liberia then faced the vicissitudes of national infancy in the continent under European imperial bondage. Much of this was made possible because Liberia reached out, stretching forth her hands, as it were. And why did she do so? To answer the question of why, one must first appreciate context and ideologies. One must appreciate the 19th century world in which Liberia, in the words of that old felicitous phrase, Liberia, the world in which Liberia then lived and moved and had its being. And then there were the ideologies building a black nation state for the regeneration of the black race would initially proceed on the notion of a civilizing and Christianizing mission. This notion was espoused by American NGO, the American Colonization Society, and its many auxiliaries. It was also espoused by Christian missions who pioneered modern education in Liberia. Joined to all of this was the ideal of a black Zion, which David Jenkins tells us was, and I quote here, the ideal held by millions of blacks in America and the Caribbean of returning to the land from which their forefathers and their foremothers were wrenched. So with high ideals and scarce human resource, the leaders of Liberia looked to the global black diaspora. When President Daniel Warner, the third president of Liberia, and his Secretary of State, Edward Wilmot Blyden, initiated and welcomed immigrants from Barbados in 1865, he was doing what his predecessors had done and what his successors would also do. He rationalized his action in these words in his first State of the Nation address to the legislature, and I quote, "The need on the part of this infant state of an intelligent and industrious immigration is urgent and obvious. In consequence of the war in the United States, we have been, for some time, deprived of our usual supply of immigrants from that country," unquote. Fast forward to the mid-20th century, and President Tubman devotes 2 pages of his 1944 inaugural address to the subject of immigration, a more guarded approach given Liberia's experience over the years. So, What were the outcomes, the results of these efforts? They were naturally many and varied. We celebrate this week, as has been said by so many, 159 years later, the contributions of the 1865 Barbadian immigrants to the upliftment of Liberia. I should add here that I was a young therapist in the State Department when, in 1965, Mr. Burley Holler delivered that great historic oration and brought home to the Liberian people, for the first time, I think, in a long time, what had transpired with the arrival of this group of immigrants from Barbados. And we all have been hearing some of the prominent names and some of the not-so-prominent names, but some of the names nonetheless. Their deeds will forever remain etched in the annals of Liberian, Barbadian, and African history more broadly. The outcomes must also include the pioneering work of the same Edward Wilmot Blyden, who was President Warner's Secretary of State. A West Indian by birth, Blyden showed up in Liberia in 1850 when racism in America thwarted his efforts to acquire a theological education. He would go on to acquire all his education in Liberia and then became a towering intellectual and a pioneering Pan-Africanist. Blyden challenged many social norms in his Liberia and influenced generations of Liberians, among them both President Arthur Berkeley and President Edwin Berkeley. I should mention here, incidentally, that I'm aware of two Liberians who are undertaking a full biographical study of President Arthur Berkeley and President Edwin Berkeley. And I think that's something very commendable. Louis Arthur Grimes, the distinguished jurist, and his clan also came under the influence of Blyden. I have first-hand account of this latter fact from Grimes's daughter, the late Dr. Mary Antoinette Grimes Brown Sherman, with whom I enjoyed intense collegial relations in the last years of her remarkable life. Let me end by applauding the recent formalization of diplomatic relations between Liberia and Barbados, and the signing of a number of memoranda of understanding. Though far too long in coming, we express the ardent hope that these instruments will lead to enriching exchanges between the two nations that will benefit the interests and values of both peoples. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dunn. It's something to note that the movement to Liberia took place before the partitioning of Africa, and we all want to know how did Liberia experience colonialism in comparison to the rest of Africa? But that's something not necessary for now. So we have Professor Colloquy, who will give us his take on Liberia-Africa relations, Caribbean relations. Professor Colloquy.
Thank you very much, Cleve. Good morning, everybody. I wanted to say thank you especially to Ambassador Witherspoon, who was trying to teach me a Liberian handshake a little earlier. I gather it was shake, slide, and snap. And I think I may have dislocated my finger trying to do this. Anyway, thank you very much for that. It's been a joy to meet everybody, and this is really a wonderful occasion for all of us here at the university and in Barbados. What I would like to talk about a little is the historical struggle of Barbadians to reconnect with Africa. And to kind of set that in context, the first thing I wanted to say was that traditionally, if you spoke to Barbadians about their African heritage, you would get one of three reactions: ignorance, denial, or embarrassment. And when you think about how African people came to Barbados in the stinking holds of slave ships, and when they arrived here, the process of conditioning and enslavement in Barbados and other countries was about destroying any connection they had with Africa. And so 300 years plus of chattel slavery was a process of stripping away that connection, of breaking that connection with Africa. So it's not surprising that traditionally the attitude to Africa among Barbadians was one of ignorance or perhaps embarrassment. Now, despite that, as I'm sure our Liberian friends have discovered, there are many African survivals in Barbadian culture. You hear it in language. You heard the extempo Calypso talking about una and wuna and so on, which are prefixes in African languages. In our food, in our dress styles, in our, not only in our language, but in our patterns of speech, what we call Bajan, that has links to our African heritage. And we even still play a game in Barbados, which is African, called Worry. I don't know, do they play Worry in Liberia? That comes to us from West Africa as well. So there are many connections that have kept alive that African heritage in Barbados, even though Barbadians sometimes were not aware of it. Now, in fact, from the very first, from the time the slave ships left the coast of Africa to come to the Caribbean in the transatlantic slave trade, those enslaved Africans were thinking about and trying to reconnect with their home. In fact, it begins before they even lose sight of the coast of Africa, when enslaved Africans plunged off the slave ships to try and get back to the African coast. Those who came to Barbados and who were enslaved and went through that process of acculturation and so on, nonetheless kept alive that African connection. And we know this from archaeological evidence. The Newton Slave Plantation, which is in Christchurch, a fantastic archaeological site, contains burials, and the archaeologists discovered this, where the bodies were oriented with the heads of the buried people to the east, towards the Atlantic coast. And symbolically, that was about reconnecting with Africa. And in the graves, you found all kinds of African grave goods, things that they had brought with them from Africa, beads and cowries and all kinds of things. So even as those first generations of Africans went through enslavement in Barbados, they were thinking about that return to Africa. Now, of course, we're here today to celebrate a particular experience of return, which is the Barbadian group that went to Liberia. But in the 19th century, there were several kinds of connections like that. In fact, the decade before the Liberian journey, the principal of Codrington College set up the West Indian mission to West Africa. And the intention was to send Barbadians to Africa in a process to reclaim and redeem the African continent. And many black West Indians, black Barbadians, wanted to participate in that because they thought that they had a responsibility to go and uplift their African brethren. And so from 1856, there was a mission in what is now Sierra Leone, the Rio Pongas mission, which was included Barbadian, black and white Barbadian missionaries. Now, so there were those kinds of attempts to connect with Africa through that policy, if you like, of redeeming African peoples. Another example, in the early 20th century, a man called Kenneth Spooner, who was born here at Sewell, Christchurch, quite close to where the airport is today, became a missionary with the Pentecostal Holiness Church. He went to South Africa, and he spent 20 years of his life until he died there, evangelizing amongst South African people. And in fact, part of his mission, part of his message, was that the African people, the African diaspora, wanted to reconnect with Africa and join with them to uplift the African people. So that spiritual connection was always there. Now, during the 19th century, we also have lots of evidence of reconnection through labor migration. And the most interesting example for me, because I've done some work on it, is seafarers from Barbados, from elsewhere in the West Indies, and for that matter, African-American seamen as well, who traveled the Atlantic seaways, arrived in Africa, and in many cases settled there. Now, some 25 years ago or so, I got a visit here at Cave Hill from a young man called Kurt Alderson, who was a black man from Cape Town. He came to Barbados to find his great-grandfather's roots. His great-grandfather had been a Barbadian seaman who had gone to Cape Town around the beginning of the 20th century and had settled there and raised a family there. So Kurt came from South Africa to find his Barbadian heritage. And in fact, you can see Kurt's story because he made a film about it on YouTube. It's called Prodigal Son. And it talks about his return from South Africa, what he found here. In fact, as part of his trip, he went to the archives, as you did yesterday, and he found that his great-grandfather was one of twins, something he never knew about his family. So that set him off on another quest to find the other side of his family. What happened to the other twin? So you have these labor migrants, seafarers is one example. There was also Barbadians were recruited to go and work in the Congo at one stage, the Belgian Congo. And so you find Barbadians dotted around in various parts of Africa during the late 19th and much of the 20th century. And what all of that demonstrates is that the Atlantic is not the division we sometimes think between the African continent and the Americas, between Africa and the Caribbean. It's actually a kind of a connective tissue which allows our people to cross and recross, to connect and reconnect throughout the history, especially from emancipation over the last 150, 200 years. Now, one of the legacies of all of that, of course, was not only this yearning to connect physically, but also culturally. So, for example, our famous Barbadian poet Kamal Brathwaite returns to Africa in his poetry. And he's one of several Barbadian writers and artists, musicians and so on, who have taken that journey in their imagination. That's why it was important to have our Faculty of Creative and Performing Arts here today, because many of our young students are taking that imaginative journey as well today. Now, the last point I wanted to make, to go to my colleague here, Rodney, who knows much more about this stuff, is that in the process of seeking to reconnect with Africa, to break through those barriers that had been created since slavery, that separate Africa from its diaspora, there have also been a series of important political movements. Of course, the UNIA, which Rodney knows a great deal about, is very important. But many of the UNIA branches founded in Africa, in South and West Africa, were in fact founded by West Indians, including Barbadians. So that diasporic connection in political terms with Africa also has a powerful link for us to explore. And of course, during the First World War and the Second World War, in the aftermath of both of those wars, West Indian intellectuals, including Barbadians, met African intellectuals in London and in Paris and so on. And together, they began to discuss the oppression that they faced in their respective countries and to develop a plan to develop an anti-colonial struggle. One example, in the aftermath of the Second World War, Hugh Springer, who was a future Governor General of Barbados, met several African leaders in London, Kenyatta, Nkrumah, and so on, met these people in London and spoke about their respective struggles against imperialism, against colonialism, against white power. And they worked together and kept in connection together right through that period of the anti-colonial struggle. And of course, I say all of that to bring us to today. Despite all of the efforts to break us apart, to break Africa and its diaspora apart, we have a history of our people struggling to reconnect on both sides of the Atlantic, struggling to connect with each other. And this initiative, this Sankofa pilgrimage, is just the latest example of that continuing struggle to reconnect. And I want to commend everybody that's been involved with this. Our own Prime Minister, Mia Mottley, of course, has been a leading figure, Ambassador Witherspoon, and so on. This is an important part of our continuing heritage trail, an effort for us to reconnect across that Atlantic, to reconnect as people. And as my brother here on my left was saying, there are all kinds of possibilities that can flow once we meet and understand and celebrate each other. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Colloquy. Just around the time where we had this movement from Barbados to Liberia, there was a scheme to bring Africans from Sierra Leone, what they call liberated Africans, to the Caribbean. Several thousands came to Jamaica, Trinidad, Tobago, St. Vincent, Grenada, and they brought with them renewed cultural elements, but none were brought to Barbados. Nevertheless, as Professor Colloquy indicated, that does not mean that, as Peter Tosh sings, never mind where you come from, as long as you're a black man or woman, you are, people know reggae. So we take, to Dr. Rodney Worrell, who would make his contribution. Dr. Worrell.
Thank you. So, greetings, my brothers and sisters and colleagues and comrades. I want to give a warm welcome, especially to my Liberian family. Yeah, in another space, I would say, long live the African Revolution, but I will still say it in this space. Thank you. Now, I want to speak about Liberia inside of the Pan-African imagination. So I will start where my colleague and teacher stopped by speaking about the desire to reconnect with Africa. So the enslaved who were violently uprooted from Africa always wanted to return to Africa. And the constant replenishing of enslaved labor meant that the memory of Africa and the desire of African people to return to Africa was strong. Even those Africans born inside this Caribbean space also was curious about the land of their ancestors, and they too carry the desire to return. whilst they recognized that it was physically impossible to return to the African continent, they sought to return spiritually, psychologically, and some of them even committed suicide with the hope of returning to join their ancestors. Now, this Caribbean space, this space in North America was very brutal, and the environment was very harsh for the development of ethnic nationalism, and therefore ethnic nationalism was not stressed inside the region, and the peoples came to the harsh realization that they were an oppressed people, and they were oppressed because of race, so racial solidarity took root. And therefore, they saw all African peoples as their brothers and sisters, and they recognized as well the importance of racial unity in struggling against their enemy and struggling for their freedom and liberation. After emancipation, many of the former enslaved, especially in the Caribbean, still had this desire to reconnect with Africa. Now they had imbibed the best of Eurocentrism, and therefore they wanted to return now to save the souls of the African people. They wanted to return to Christianize the Africans, and they felt that the skills and talents that they had at their disposal, they could now utilize these in building the African continent. Now, Liberia, from its creation, let us say from the 1820s, was an important space in the psyche of Pan-Africanists. Liberia represented the space that will lead to the regeneration of the African continent. The American Colonization Society, and I would say the xenophobic American Colonization Society, sought to address or redress the race question by exporting or resettling African Americans in Liberia and elsewhere. There was some tension between the various camps of Pan-Africanism. On the one hand, people like Dr. Martin Delaney and Frederick Douglass and others opposed and condemned the work of the American Colonization Society in seeking to settle the race question by migration. What is important about the American Colonization Society, however, was that they were able to tap into the sentiment of African people and Caribbean people of returning. And therefore, from as early as 1829, one of the pioneering Pan-Africanists, John Russwurm, from Jamaica, returned, or he went to Liberia, where he became editor of I think the Liberal Herald and a school superintendent. And he was followed in the 1850s, my brother mentioned the famous name of Edward Wilmot Blyden from the Danish West Indies. And Edward Wilmot Blyden was the leading black nationalist, and I prefer to use the term Pan-Africanist, but I'm not going to split hairs today, but the leading black nationalist of the 19th century, he migrated to Liberia, and he felt that Liberia represented the site that would lead to the regeneration of Africa. In fact, he believed that there were real possibilities if the combined talents of Africans in the diaspora and Africans on the continent, that Liberia could be that space. And he was joined by the Reverend Alexander Cromwell, about a year later in the 1850s as well. And Cromwell was very excited about living in a black-dominated society. In fact, he made the boast that he was glad that his children would now be born under a black society with a black government, etc. Also, the migration efforts, the various waves, were tied to the level of repression taking place. In the case of, we talk about the Fugitive Slave Act inside the United States. This led to many African Americans thinking about migrating. And after the defeat of Reconstruction, because some of them that talked about migrating thought that there would be possibilities for black empowerment during the period of Reconstruction, but they recognized that the Reconstruction, after it was defeated, it meant lynching, it meant beatings, it meant Jim and Jane Crow laws, and many of them desired to leave. And the champion or the major advocate of this project was Bishop Henry McNeil Turner. And he was very disappointed with the turn of events inside of the United States. And Turner, along with Dr. Martin Delany, who was critical of the early efforts of the American Colonization Society, did form a Liberian migration company where they migrated, I think, 200 African Americans in 1878. When the Supreme Court in the United States said that the civil rights law was unconstitutional, it led Henry McNeil Turner to place greater emphasis on migration, and he even cursed the United States Constitution. He called it a dirty rag that should be spat upon by all African Americans. And he made a plea for wealthy African Americans to invest their monies inside of Liberia. So these are some of the important 19th century Pan-African figures that saw Liberia as this special space. Now we come to the 20th century. Marcus Messiah Garvey, the greatest Pan-Africanist of the 20th century, leading this large mass-based formation, also recognized the psychic symbolism inside of Liberia, and Garvey sent 3 missions seeking to relocate the UNIA headquarters to Liberia. In fact, I think you could talk about the audacity of Garvey, but he wrote to his followers, I think it was in 1920, saying, well, next year, that by the time next year, the next People's Convention, the headquarters would be moved to Liberia. And he was not given permission because it was felt that the pressure of British imperialism, French imperialism, and the United States imperialism, as well as the political class, the reactionary political class in Liberia, were fearful of having Liberia as the capital of Garveyism. So the Garvey project failed, but even up to the early 1930s, Garveyites in Barbados and elsewhere still made the desire and still said that they wanted to go to Liberia. And my final Pan-Africanist that I will mention is George Padmore, the great Trinidadian Pan-Africanist who ended his life as Kwame Nkrumah's advisor on African affairs. So we're talking about a giant of Pan-Africanism. Padmore was a disciple, or his father was a staunch disciple of Blyden. And some of this seemed to have filtered down into Padmore's consciousness because one of his first Pan-Africanist activities in terms of organizing was with a Liberian called Philip Davies. He formed a student entity that was aimed at, that was aimed at discussing, I should not say discussing, but it was aimed at preventing, this was the period when the sovereignty of Liberia was being circumscribed. So this entity lobbied for the sovereignty of Liberia. The first Pan-African Conference in 1900 emphasized or underlined the importance of the independent states of Liberia, Abyssinia or Ethiopia, and Haiti. But at this present time, Haiti was under the boot of the United States because the United States had invaded Haiti in 1915. So the independence of Liberia meant a lot. Padmore abandoned his studies at Fisk, went to Howard where he said that he was going to study law with a view of going to practice in Liberia. After he became a leading Marxist and he moved from the race first to class and class struggle, he was still fixated on the Liberian question. And he wrote about two important articles, Hands Off Liberia, and an important pamphlet called American Imperialism Enslaved Liberia. Now there is some controversy as to whether Padmore was expelled or whether he resigned. We don't know which one came first. But the Communist International said that they expelled Padmore, this is about in 1934, and for three things. And one of these transgressions was because he was working on the national question of Liberia. Padmore had supported the Jones Project about saving Liberia. And he had written to W.E.B. Du Bois and said that, you know, white politicians are no different to black ones, but we must, you know, do what we can to save Liberia from the wolves. By this time, Padmore had become very disillusioned, however, with the Comintern proletarian internationalism, and he was once a bitter critic of Garvey's back to Africa idea, but now he was advocating that blacks should abandon United States that was going fascist, Britain that was going fascist. The Soviet Union had disappointed them and moved to Liberia and construct this space. By the 1950s, Ghana was the mecca of Pan-Africanism on the African continent. Kwame Nkrumah was building African Union, or the organic unification of the African continent, as well as Ghana was now the beachhead for socialism, as well as the beachhead in terms of freeing the African continent from colonialism. However, in closing, I will say that for many years, Liberia was the mecca of Pan-Africanism on the African continent. Long live Liberia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Worrell. Professor Colloquy pointed to the continuity of Africanisms in the region. We must acknowledge the cultural components of all of this. We're in the season of emancipation, and we are soon going into crop over. We have the Mother Sallies, the Stilt Walkers, the Tukban. I know you all experienced the Tukban yesterday down at the museum, did you? And I'm certain tomorrow night you'll have more of it. Continuities. Good. So we're going to have a response from Dr. Carrie Banton, and then we'll have the open mic.
All right. How interesting to hear all of these different areas of Caribbean convergence with Liberia specifically and Africa more broadly coming together today from these different panelists. And you know, there's some themes that are common, I think, across all the presenters in terms of thinking about African desires, how Africans, whether in the Caribbean or in Africa, the lengths that they would go to realize their own destiny, to realize their own freedom. It brings me, if you guys have seen, I'm sure you guys have seen Amistad, right? You remember Amistad, the ship that was the site of one of the biggest slave ship rebellions, where they tried to turn around the ship and go back to Africa and ended up in the United States, right? And you have that great speech about, you know, what freedom is, and the lengths people will break free their chains, you know, to find home. And we can see that from the earliest movement of Africans out of Africa to the Caribbean, and in spite of the horrific conditions, in spite of the suffering, that memory of Africa never left. In fact, it grew and grew, and Africa nurtured ways and ideas about how they might get back home, and many of them did, and that continued throughout the various periods, all the way up to Padmore and other people who have been trying to free Africa from the chains of colonialism and imperialism. So this migration here today, the Sankofa voyage, is part of, we're standing on the shoulders of giants. Thank you. We are standing on the shoulders of giants, meaning that our ancestors have left work for us to continue to do, to build ourselves, to build relationships, to stretch our hands across the Atlantic towards each other, to continue a mission that is unfinished. And I think that is what our panelist has highlighted today. I'll cut it short so that we can have some questions, if you'll allow it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Banton. So we have, the floor is now open. You can ask questions, make comments. It will be kind of you if you could identify yourself so the rest of the audience can know who you are. Who's going first?
Over here. Is there a mic?
Hi, my name's Arzinda Abdu Bensi. I guess I'm just curious if you guys ever came across the indigenous people of Liberia when you were doing your research and what you found out about them. So I would like to know more information if you can highlight that. If you can, thank you.
Dr. Dunn, you should go first.
That's one for you. I'm not so sure what to say about that, since my sense is that it's a given that the indigenous people are there. And what I was alluding to at some point earlier on was this Liberian quest or search for identity that is represented by what we are doing here will find its way back to Liberia and engage with other groups, perhaps indigenous groups, certainly, groups from, I said earlier, from many other parts of Africa and many other parts of the black diaspora, generally speaking. So I think at that point in time that maybe your question will become sort of relevant to that situation.
It's imperative that, you know, we address that question, and, you know, obviously you don't have a Liberian state without the indigenous people, and we have to address that. A part of what I was pointing to today about rethinking the narratives and rethinking the archives, rethinking how we've approached Liberia and where the knowledge about Liberia come from, who has made this knowledge that we carry with us, who created that information. If Liberia was a colony created by the United States, and most of how we approach that knowledge is through the information written down by Americans or missionaries, we have to consider what they wrote down and what they considered worthy and who they considered worthy to write down information about. And so we must know that in many of that early period, they didn't think the indigenous worthy of creating useful knowledge. And so we have to rethink that. And as we're rethinking the Liberian nation in this period of rebirth, we have to consider the Kru, the Bassa, all the various ethnic groups as we're trying to put the nation back together. We have to think about new forms of information beyond history. As you will hear later on what Dr. Riley and Craig and, you know, other scholars are working on, what archaeology is saying, what the indigenous people were doing in Liberia to create that nation before other folks arrived. We have to give new thought to that if we want to create new narratives about what the relationship means for a Liberian nation that wants to go forward.
Question. Is it true that the settlers, when they settled, they used the indigenous people as slaves? Oh, my name is Jay.
Well, I don't know how to approach it, because when you say settlers, I'm thinking about many different groups, not just one group of people. And I think what you are alluding to, in my mind, is the process of nation building. It's messy. It's like you have to break eggs to make omelets. Don't you? I think we are still struggling with the issue of how do you bring about cultural, social unification in Liberia as we speak. I think that is what you're alluding to when you use the word slave.
If I could just say a little bit about that. What I've learned about this subject in giving various different talks about the book is that it's a very uncomfortable one, but it's very necessary. It's a necessary conversation that we must have if we are to go forward. And as you can see in the United States, where history, what we learn and what we discuss and what we talk about is under legislation because it's difficult and it makes people uncomfortable. And I hope that this does not become the trend in other areas of the diaspora where we are so emotionally and intellectually fragile that we cannot have these kinds of conversations that are necessary. As Dr. Dunn said, in the effort of creating a nation state, sometimes, you know, difficult moments happen and we have to reckon with them. those things, you know, we might even think about it today. You know, you might go to certain places and there are categories called houseboys, right? And you wonder about that kind of a servant dynamic, how that fits into the histories of what we know about power relationships. And so when we think about the relationships about between arriving migrants, whether it's the Americo-Liberians or the Barbadian groups and the indigenous and the recaptive groups, it's a very delicate thing that we have to think about in terms of the relationships of power. And it doesn't neatly fit into the historical narratives that we're accustomed to, and it's not necessarily a black and white relationship. But it's difficult, it's a difficult one that we have to reckon with and that we have to talk about if we're to move forward.
Okay, my name is Edward Clabrook. I'm from Liberia. I am indeed a governess, and I also work with Firestone. So, Dr. Warren, during your presentation, you talk about the imperialist struggle to obstruct Dr. Professor Garvin from going to Liberia with his organization. But it is this factor of the use Firestone. So you didn't mention anything about that. Can you elaborate?
Okay, I think part of Padmore's concern, especially when he said hands off Liberia, was the fact that Liberia seemed always in debt, in serious debt. And I think it was around 1925 or so that Liberia was in serious debt. In fact, Garvey at one time was considering the possibility of seeing if he could assist Liberia with his money, right? And at first, it sounded like the government was listening to this possibility. But I think a subsidiary of the Firestone Corporation had given the Liberian government, I don't remember the sum of money, but they were paying back a debt from 1912. And the conditionalities of the loan was so harsh, right? I think they're saying 8 administrators as part of the conditionalities of the loan. So for all intents and purposes to Padmore and those persons on the left. In fact, it's about Firestone, imperialism, enslaved Liberia. So for a long time, then the shadow of Firestone loomed large over Liberia. And when we enter the Marxist phraseology now, we're talking about economic imperialism, and therefore the ability of a nation to be said to be truly independent or even independent, and they're really under the direction of these imperialists. And then there was a lot of conversation taking place as well about whether one of the larger imperialist nations should take over Liberia as well, right? Talking about whether the British should take over or whether the French should take over because they felt that they needed this kind of assistance. So yeah, you are correct. I didn't mention it, but you know, in the absence of time, I have to keep it short. Thank you. Very good question.
Cleve, can I just add something? When Rodney was speaking, he was talking about the fact that Liberia was really the beacon of freedom for African people, people in the diaspora in the 19th century. The other great beacon of freedom for Caribbean people in the 19th century was Haiti. And when you think about the post-independence history of Liberia and Haiti, and you see that the suffering those two countries have gone through, the fact that they were the great beacons of black freedom in the 19th century seems to be a factor they had in common. And it may be that when you think about, the depredations on both of those societies through colonialism and imperialism, that they were targeted precisely because they were beacons of freedom for black people. By the way, Prof. Banton was speaking about Amistad and the attempt by the enslaved people on that ship to take control and sail back to Africa. Locally in the Caribbean, in Jamaica and so on, when we had maritime marinage, people fleeing across the sea, the place they would head to was Haiti, because they knew once they set foot in Haiti, they would be free. And so I know we're here to celebrate the link with Liberia today, but it would be a tragedy if we didn't remember what's happening in Haiti and our responsibility there.
So I want to, I know you guys, they asked you the question, but my fellow Liberian asked the question about where pardon me? I'm Shireen Smith. I had different hair. Yeah, I had my hair wrapped yesterday. But I'm the one who produced the documentary series, The Children of Lemongrass Street Liberians in Barbados, Barbadians in Liberia. But to address your question, when we get to learn, and that's what's important, and we get to learn the truth. We get to correct the mistakes and the information that's been put out there that several of the people on our panel kind of talked about a little bit. But when you watch that docu-series, you hear firsthand some of the accounts of what you're talking about, how these were the Barbadians who went to Liberia, how they dealt with the indigenous people, that relationship. But I like to learn, and it's important that I get the facts. So one of the most famous Liberian writers, Dr. Patrick Burroughs, he also said we shouldn't run away from the question you asked. And I want to recommend to you, everybody in here, I haven't met Patrick in person, I've just talked to him, but I bought this book. I've read it 3 times. Every Liberian should buy this book. The title is Liberia and the Quest for Freedom, the half that has never been told. Patrick addressed your question hands-on. His research is just dynamic. He takes it on. If you want to know the truth, if you want to ask questions, if you want your mind to become like, hey, really? Or even question Patrick, go on Amazon. You want to know your Liberian history? This book, I said I read it on a plane before the flight even landed. I read it before I got here. Because every time I read it, I learn something new. Every Liberian, have you guys, I'm sure Dr. Dunn, you're familiar with Patrick, right?
Surely.
And you guys have worked together. And I think, but every Liberian should get this book to learn what Patrick is talking about. And to answer your question, we shouldn't run away from that question and to find out the details. He didn't ask me to bring his book here and talk about it. But, pardon me? No, that's...
May I make a comment on that, on what she did?
I'm not sitting up there, but...
Okay, thank you very much for the book. I just thought that I should add one more thing. And there's a woman called Abiodun Bowen-Jones who did her doctoral dissertation at Northwestern University in the United States, graduating in 1960. She has since passed away. It is her dissertation that I would recommend to this group. The title of that dissertation is The Struggle for Political and Social Unification in Liberia up to 1930. I think the question that was raised earlier where the word slave was used, that book of that dissertation will illuminate quite a bit of the issues that come about as a result of that question. Thank you.
Yes.
Good afternoon to everyone. I want to address the panel. Earlier you spoke about the contributions from Anthony Barclay, President Anthony Barclay, and several of the panelists discussed his contributions to Liberia. I recently did an ancestry DNA test. Now, that I am related to President Anthony Barclay. So I wanted to share that with the panelists and with the Liberians who are here.
Yeah, uncle and cousin.
No, I never did that. I have this thing about not being on a database. People have enough information on me already.
What is she doing?
She was talking about Arthur Barclay. I am very fascinated, and I hope I can get further information from you later on, because I think, speaking of the new archives that I was talking about, it's very fascinating as you all are here and you were at the archives yesterday looking at genealogy and ancestry, that Ancestry.com is generating so much money holding that kind of information that is needed by folks like yourself to find your identity, right? So the question of like who owns these kinds of data that Black people need to situate themselves in the world and locate their families, very fascinating. And I think it's something that we ought to be thinking about more, that this kind of information is behind a paywall and not accessible to more people.
Thank you very much, Dr. Banton. Thank you very much, Dr. Dunn. Thank you very much, Professor Cobley. And thank you very much, Dr. Worrell. A round of applause for our panelists. I'd like to invite on the stage Ambassador Llewellyn Witherspoon. Ambassador. Okay.
So we can leave?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you do your vote, thanks. Yeah.
Okay, good afternoon. Good afternoon, friends, relatives. First of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Henderson Carter and the University of West Indies at Cave Hill for hosting us here today and for providing an enabling environment for learning and for meeting our friends, new relatives that we found, and the opportunity to explore the beautiful campus. I think we will have to, we may not have to go ahead with having a survey done after this event, which means by the weekend, because from what I've seen in each of your faces and your laughs, in spite of your fatigue, is a profound sense of happiness and appreciation for being able to do something that our ancestors didn't do, not couldn't do, and to be here today invoking their presence with us as we drive along and walk along some of these very streets that they walked along. And I think their spirits and the spirits of their ancestors are with us during this period. The itinerary was constructed in such a way to ensure that we got maximum impact from this opportunity. And I think it has overwhelmed a few of us because I think about half of us are probably still sleeping. But I hope they're getting up now because the bus leaves from the hotel at 4 o'clock, coming down to the Bay Street Esplanade for the laying of the plaque and the paying of libation. But so I just want to thank you and encourage you to get as much rest as you can because we still have a few very, very busy events ahead of us. But we're nearing the end now, and it's going to be a bittersweet departure because I think we've all soaked up so much of our country that most of us have never seen before, and leaving is going to be difficult, but thankfully, it will be not to return, but going to hurriedly return. I already know some people that are coming back for crop over. So I encourage you to take advantage of the time here, the rest of the time here. Enjoy yourselves, explore our great country, hire taxis or buses, go out, see some of the places we didn't go to. I know everyone was complaining that the bus didn't go down Rihanna Drive. It's a beautiful thing to take in. You can combine and get in a bus and go down to Rihanna Drive and really see the place. It's really nice. It's very historical. You can also go to the church, St. Mark's Church, where the Barclay family vault is located, and as well as the grave of London-born is in the same area. So again, I just want to thank you. Let me just be brief. I know we are hungry. Food is ready. But a big thanks to the staff, all of those who have been responsible for logistics here today, and of course to our bus drivers who've been so kind and dutiful in taking us around. And not last but not least to Prime Minister Mia Motley and her government. They have spared no expense and no effort to ensure that this historic event is extremely memorable, and that as we walk through the door going to the aircraft, we'll realize that that door is going to stay open for us when we come back. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. You all coming back for crop over? See you at 4 in the morning. See you at the Pick of the Crop Finals. See you at Bridgetown Market. We have lunch on sale in the back. It's $15 US or 30 Barbados dollars. We are going to have presentations during the lunch by Dr. Matthew Riley and his team. So that will be towards the end of lunch. Okay? That's it. Thank you very much.